I've been the chair of the Standing Committee of Citizenship and Immigration, and I've been a member since 2015. So we have studied this topic, and we tabled a report also. So today I will go through a few things, and there might be some overlap also what Professor Hampson said. I will, as we prepare to talk about how we can come together as a global community to address the global refugee crisis, which is what the United Nations Global Compact on Migration and Global Compact on Refugees are all about. We should make sure that we have a good handle on just what the global situation is and what is driving that global situation. So based on the UN Refugee Agency, at the end of 2020, 82.4 million people worldwide were forcibly displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, or events seriously disturbing public order. Of those, just 20.7 million are classified as refugees. In this context, using the globally agreed definition of refugees as defined in the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugee. A refugee must be someone who is now outside the borders of their home country. These people fall under the mandate of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and signatories to the convention have obligations to help them. The vast majority of the globally displaced, close to 48 million people, are classified as IDPs, or internally displaced persons. These are the people who are still located within their home country, but driven from their homes due to war, persecution, or other factors. For example, the Yazidi people in northern Iraq. IDPs have less protection under the international law, and it can be more difficult to help them without the support of their home country, who in some cases are complacent in where they are displaced. So rounding the global numbers, there are 5.7 million Palestinian refugees, 4.1 million asylum seekers, and 3.9 million Venezuelans displaced abroad. Some 68% come from just 5 countries, 27% from Syria, 16% from Venezuela, 11% from Afghanistan, 9% from South Sudan, and 5% from Myanmar. As we can see from these numbers, conflict and political instability are major drivers of migration and displacement. The civil war in Syria, political instability in Venezuela, and the persecution of the Rohingya Muslim minority in Myanmar are all the major drivers of the global migration. It would also be a mistake, though, to look only at conflict and political instability. Important as they are, for what would you give us the full picture? Lack of economic opportunity is another major driver of immigration, both regular as well as irregular. Searching for economic opportunity is behind a lot of migration we are seeing northward from South and Central America. Like all of us, people just wanting the opportunity to provide for their children and not seeing the opportunity to do so at home. And other emerging driver of migration we should be aware of is the climate change. The UN Global Compact on Refugees, adopted in December of 2018, recognized that climate, environmental degradation, and disasters increasingly interact with the drivers of refugee movements. So from immediate climate-caused disasters, such as extreme weather events, such as abnormality, heavy rainfall, prolonged droughts, environmental degradation or sea level rise, and cyclones, to slow climate-caused impacts, such as changing temperature, making it no longer possible to maintain crops, livestock, climate is an increasing cause of displacement. Now, coming to Canada's role in immigration and in developmental aid. Although Canada is a small country, but we try to punch over our weight when it comes to refugee and immigration policy. The world is facing a refugee crisis, and Canada will continue to do its part as a global leader in the refugee resettlement. In 2020, we welcomed a third of all refugee resettlements around the world. Last year, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee called Canada a bright light in a horrible year for refugee resettlement, and recently said that Canada continued to be a strong resettlement country, even as everybody else was backing down. But we are not stopping there. So we continue to pioneer new ways to welcome the world's most vulnerable, including through the Economic Mobility Pilot Project, and recently became the first country in the world to offer a dedicated immigration program for the journalists, activists, and other persecuted for standing up for human rights. But when it comes to the global migration challenge, it is important to remember two things. It won't be solved through resettlement alone. And not really everyone wants to resettle in another country permanently anyways. Resettlement is important, and Canada has done a lot, and we can do more. And I will talk more about that shortly, but it is not possible to resettle 21 million people. And many of them, while in need of a temporary home, hope and want to one day return to their old lives and their home countries once it is safe and possible for them to do so. That's why a holistic approach to the global migration crisis must include not just resettlement. It must look at the burden faced by the countries hosting refugees. 86% of the refugees are hosted in developing countries to help provide safe and dignified care to the refugee population. And our approach must also look at the root causes that are driving migration in the first place, bringing peace and stability to troubled regions of the world by ending conflict and building democratic institutions, by investing in development programs that provide economic opportunity at home to them, and also by addressing the global climate change challenge. These must and do form key parts of Canada's foreign policy, aid, and development agendas. As just one example, Canada has recently assumed the chair of MIRPS, an international forum focused on developing and mobilizing solutions to migration crisis in Central America. We have gone through a lot of changes to immigration levels since 2015. Since we were first elected in 2015, we have seen regular significant increases in our annual immigration levels. And for the first time, the introduction of multi-year immigration levels plan. So Canada's target for immigration of all categories in 2021 is 401,000, with 411,000 targeted for the next year, 2022, and 421,000 being the target for 2023. This is across all categories of immigration, including the economic, as well as the family reunification, refugees, and humanitarian programs. While the COVID posed a challenge, media reports indicate Canada landed nearly 40,000 new permanent residents in August. Given the global challenges caused by the pandemic, programs have focused more on migrants already within Canada. Canada relies on the UNHCR and the International Organization for Migration to help screen and process refugees, and many of their efforts were curtailed during the pandemic. But as they ramp their activities back up, Canada stands ready to do our part once more. We have increased family reunification for Yazidis, launched a new refugee stream for human rights defenders, and nearly doubled the number of spaces for protected persons. We also introduced virtual hearings at the IRB to to speed up the processing and ensure applications are processed despite COVID closures. Canada has also given the world a new model in the private sponsorship program. This is where community groups and organizations come together to take responsibility for welcoming and caring for refugees to Canada in their first year. During the Syrian refugee program, the demand to help refugees outstrip the number of the refugees the government and its partners could process. While not a replacement for the government-assisted refugee program, government-assisted refugees tend to be the most in need of Canada's help. The private sponsor program is a force multiplier and a Canadian success story we are trying to export to the other countries. Since 2016, I have met those groups, those not-for-profit organizations, those people who came together to welcome the Syrian refugees. And I think this is really something which we need to learn from. Now comes the need for international coordination. No one country can tackle the global migration crisis alone. There needs to be international cooperation as well as coordination. And developed countries like Canada need to step up and have the backs of the developing countries that are largely on the front lines of the crisis. And that's really what the UN Global Compacts are all about. While the two global compacts are non-binding, they do not serve to strengthen the norms, principles, rules, and decision-making processes to allow for more effective international cooperation in managing migration. The compacts aim to replace the previous ad hoc reactions to major global flaws of migration with regulated process and to prevent the imposition of a disproportionately heavy burden on reception countries. Some specifics of the compact. A great Canadian former Supreme Court Justice, Louis Arbour, played a key role as the UN Special Representative of International Migration in the development of the Global Compact on Migration. It is intended to present a framework for international cooperation on migrants and address all aspects of international migration, including humanitarian, developmental, and human rights related issues. It sets out a number of objectives, followed by a range of actions considered to be relevant, policy instruments, and best practices. These include minimize the drivers and factors that compel people to leave the country of their origin, enhance the availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration, address and reduce vulnerability in migration, also save lives and establish, coordinate international efforts on missing migrants, manage borders in an integrated, secure, and coordinated manner, use migration detention only as a measure of last resort and work towards alternatives, and empower migrants and societies to realize full inclusion and social cohesion. Member states are expected to implement the Global Compact management, migration within their own countries, as well as regional and global levels and an international migration review forum will be held every 4 years, starting in 2022, and provide ways to report progress, best practices, and innovative approaches to migration management. Similarly, the Global Compact on Refugees, or GCR, is a non-binding document that sees states commit to sharing responsibility and the burden of hosting refugees in a more predictable manner. The objectives include to ease pressure on host countries as well as the communities in which refugees live, to enhance the refugee self-reliance, to expand access to third country solutions, and to support conditions for safe return of refugees in the country of origin. It also includes regular reporting and 4-year reviews and seeks to introduce a multi-stakeholder and partnership approach involving new actors such as financial institutions like the World Bank, the private sector, and cities in the mobilization of sustainable public and private funding for humanitarian and development assistance. The House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration studied them, and at that time it was chaired by my colleague Rob Oliphant, and we tabled a report on the Global Compacts in December of 2018 as part of a larger ongoing study at the time of the trends driving international migration. The debate in the committee by different parties, their approach was really very different. It was important at that time to conduct these hearings and hear from expert witnesses about what these compacts, then still being developed, sought to do, and more importantly, what they didn't do. We have seen in the last decade rising anti-immigration sentiments in the right wing in Europe and closer to home. Some of these groups sought to portray the global compacts as a threat to a country's sovereignty, as superseding domestic laws, as a threat to media freedom, and more. Unfortunately, in the questioning, the conservative members, when we studied that back in December 2018, seemed to give some credence to these theories. As we heard clearly in the testimony, these frictions could not be further from truth. The committee heard that both global compacts align with the Canada's immigration and asylum policies, and that Canada has set the standards for the world in terms of migration management. The global compacts allow Canada to promote its best practices and vision for migration and refugee management. The committee heard very clearly that Canada is well suited to not only implement what is aspired to in both global compacts, but also to learn from them. Thankfully, with their adoption, the misinformation and mischaracterization of the compacts has largely faded away. In the last election, while I may disagree with some of the choices the Conservatives made in their immigration platform, all major parties largely agreed on the broad principles driving Canada's immigration policy. While there will be debates around the process and areas of focus, Canadians and their representatives are in a broad agreement. Migration is important, and Canada has an important global role to play. The People's Party remains an exception, but thankfully also remains on the fringe. We shouldn't take this for granted, though. Canada is not immune to the global anti-immigrant sentiments. Canada's immigration policy relies on the consent and the support of the Canadian people, and it is up to all of us to continue to make the case for why strong immigration levels are important necessarily, and to ensure the system and the choices we make are both transparent, fair, and justifiable. For the fact is, while the humanitarian arguments is strong and compelling, immigration is also in Canada's own economic self-interest. The birth rate for our Canadian-born population is on a decline. We need immigration to grow our population, to support our economic growth, and to maintain the social services that retiring Canadians are relying on. And by helping address the factors driving global migration, Canada benefits from a world that is safer and more stable. As now we are coming towards the end of the pandemic and need to begin moving forward after COVID, but progress on the GCM and GCR is made next year, we will likely see that the pandemic has stunted the hope for progress. And at the end of the day, the compacts will only be as successful as the work we put into them. As we begin to look past the pandemic, it will be important to redouble global efforts to address the migration and refugee crisis. The compacts provide a framework and an opportunity for Canada to be the leader for the world.